Welcome everyone to the Iowa Grain Quality Initiative podcast. We're doing a video podcast today. I'm Brian Doherty. I'm a field ag engineer with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and our guest today is Garland Dahlke. He's an assistant scientist with Iowa State University Department of Animal Science and the Iowa Beef Center. And so due to the recent storm damage from the derecho that went through the state, what we wanted to talk about today are some options for wind damaged corn and cover a little bit on feeding some of the damaged grain. So welcome, Garland. If you want to go ahead and take it away and share your information, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A at the end.
All right, thank you, Brian. So we had a little storm a couple weeks ago. I guess August 10th is when it blew through, and did a little number on our corn crop. Our beans still stand pretty nice, but the corn is a little bit flat. And it's flat in some places, in other places not too bad. So it's kind of hit and miss where it really did its damage. But because of that, there's some issues going on. And just this past week, I got a bunch of samples back. And what I did is I went out and I sampled a bunch of this corn that was still standing and the corn that was flattened out, like the picture here. And just going through the fields, and I did the samples and ground it up like silage, like corn silage samples is really what I was looking at. The dry matter was running 22 to 40% dry matter. So it's about right dry matter to start chopping. That 40% you probably need to be added already. Some of it was a little on the wetter side, but most of it was approaching that 30 to 40% dry matter. So I say it's kind of corn silage moisture as far as that goes. Some of the locations I was at were drought stressed. So there was some issues before the storm ever hit. So then we got to think about nitrates probably. The milk line in the kernels was about 3/4 on some of the wetter stuff to 1/4 on some of the drier stuff. So I say that the moisture it's a little bit all over the board, but it was tending more towards the drier side. There was not much corn showing any black layer, so that'll have some implications for dry grain quality later on. And like I said, there was some corn still standing, and then there's some that was flat on the ground. Some of the stuff that was flat was kinked over like a broken straw. Some of it was just kind of tipped real heavy, and it looked like everything was still intact, but it was just laying a little low. So we had all sorts of issues there. From the analysis I did on just the corn samples, I got the dry matter content. Some of the flat corn, which was either kinked or just laying there, that actually had less dry matter than the standing corn. The corn that's still standing, a lot of it lost quite a bit of the leaf tissue, and it's kind of laying bare. So the wind is, and we had a warm week, and it was in the 90s the week following the storm. So that stuff was actually drying out faster than the stuff laying there. And so like my samples come back, my standing corn was almost 43% dry matter. My wet corn, all my samples combined was about 40% dry matter. So that's one of the things going on. The crude protein levels are about the same. The standing corn had a little bit more damage, I think tissue damage in some regards. And so like the crude protein solubility was a little bit higher. And there's a little bit higher ammonia levels in that tissue. It doesn't really show up on my picture here, but there was a touch of ammonia. So I'm thinking it's from the tissue damage from the corn that was standing, got shredded pretty bad, where the other stuff kind of blew over, and that was about it. As far as the carbohydrates, the starch and sugars, the standing corn, you see it was a little bit higher non-fiber carbohydrate, the NFC value, a couple percentage points higher. The starch levels were a little bit higher. And part of that may be because those standing stalks did lose some leaves, and so it was more cob relative to leaf. And I guess that brings up another point. The fields that I went through, a lot of times when you think about corn that tips over, you think about cob loss and all that kind of stuff. And usually that's, insects, and then the cob gets kind of compromised in the shank and it comes off. But this corn always pretty solid. If the machine could grab the corn stalk and pull it in, it'll probably get the cob. I don't think there'll be a whole lot of cobs laying out there in the field if the machine can get a hold of the stalks. I say the integrity of that shank was really good, and the cob was there. So anyway, it did give us a little higher starch and sugar levels because of that, and it may keep the quality up in terms of silage better. The fiber content of these plants was a little interesting. The NDF, or neutral detergent fiber, was higher in the corn that was tipped over. The total tract NDF digestibility was a little higher in the plants that were tipped over. The ADF was a little bit higher, of course, in those plants. And I guess the thing that was kind of interesting, and it's probably makes sense as you think about it, the lignin concentration as a percent of the NDF was slightly higher in the standing corn. So lignin gives that plant integrity, and the standing corn had a little bit more lignin in it, and that makes sense why that would maybe have stood better than the corn, and why the digestibility was better in the corn that tipped over. And I say, and this is on a silage basis, and I kind of looked at silage first because a lot of times that's where we're going to maybe salvage something like this. So, and then the other thing though is if we do look at silage, is the ash content. Now these samples I grabbed were all hand cut. It wasn't a machine harvest. And even though they were hand cut, the flattened corn did have a higher ash content than the standing corn did. You can see here about half a percentage point more. And I think that's corn that tipped over caught a lot of debris, dust and dirt blowing around, and that's kind of what goes on. As we harvest this stuff for silage, and you get machines working in there, it probably will pull in a whole lot more ash. And there was some data out of Florida where they had a hurricane and it blew a bunch of corn over, and that's what happened. When they harvest it and get machines in there, then they pull in the whole lot more dirt than what's already there. So that's something just to be aware of, that ash. And they say that can be a contaminant as well as we get into our talk. The energy advantage of the standing corn versus the flat corn, okay, there is a little energy advantage because our starch content and values were higher in that standing corn, a little better, kernels and fill and all that. So you can see just a slight advantage in net energy. For maintenance gain, we look at that all the time in cattle rations or TDN. So there's a little advantage there. Not a whole lot though, it's pretty close really. And I guess really the gist of it all, when you get down to it, is if you're going to take this corn and harvest it, when you get all done, it's worthwhile getting a forage test on it. Here I got one of my tests from the corn that was standing. And just a good commercial forage lab will help you decide what to do with it and how to feed it. Because I say there is a lot of good feeding value in that material. And the samples I took were taken 2 weeks after the storm, and that's when a lot of people were planning to start doing their silage anyway. So the stuff is still fairly good. As longer it lays around, then we start turning in from decent feed to compost because it starts getting wet and flat, and who knows what the weather will become. But at 2 weeks after that big storm, the stuff was still pretty good. But I say to really identify what you're working with, a forage test on a sample of the silage you chop really helps you decide what to do with it. For those of you that need dry grain and are hoping that you can combine this stuff later, there's some issues there that may pop up, time will tell. The standing corn, the thing with that is we lost a lot of leaves, and a lot of that corn, it may have been dented or about dented. Some of the fields were half dented that I went through. Some were dented down to a quarter milk line. So they are almost mature. But, those plants did take quite a bit of abuse, and how much the stalk will support the rest of that kernel development, so that we get a decent test weight, is to be determined. But I'm guessing the corn that got flattened out, especially that got kinked, you're going to have some test weight issues there because you're just not getting the nutrients to the cob that you normally would. So I guess that's something to be aware of. And depending on how far along that corn was when it got blasted by the wind will make a difference. So that's just one thing to be aware of. There's an expectation that there'll be some new mold growth, because it has been inoculated with a lot of dust and dirt. And so there's molds and mycotoxins that are out in the field from emergence on, and those are existing molds and mycotoxins. A lot of that's there. We deal with it, depending on the year, if it's going to become a problem or not. So like in a wet year, a lot of times you'll see a lot of vomitoxin in a field, even if it's good corn standing. In a dry year, like out towards Carroll this year, they had quite a bit of dry weather. It kind of anticipate a little bit of aflatoxin issues going on. And those are probably there before this storm ever hit, because they're in the soil, and depending on the environment and the year, those kind of things will happen. But when we have these wind problems like we had here, we get a lot of stuff blowing around, and a lot of, I guess, bugs inoculate the corn, and for a lack of a better phrase, and we can get some new stuff going on. So sometimes some of those black spotty or those blue-green molds that show up in corn in the end of the year, I mean, this is kind of the kind of situation that brings that on. So there will be some issues there, and I don't know if they'll really cause mycotoxins. A lot of times our mycotoxin problems are from emergence, the molds that get inoculated in that plant that emerges from the soil. But you can get a lot of things that make corn look off color and not real pretty to look at. And so it's harder to sell in some situations, and that we may run into that a little bit here. So the test weight, the mold growth are all issues that we're going to be aware of. The other thing is trying to get it picked up off the field, and I'll leave that up to the engineers to figure out how that happens. But we did do a lot of silage chopping at Beef Nutrition this past week, and it actually went pretty good for a field that was 50% blown over. It did work fairly well, so maybe we'll be okay. In terms of, like, say, these molds and mycotoxins, as these cobs are exposed to the elements, and I say as these, especially these plants that blew over and the husks get compromised a little bit, they say that does open up exposure. And I say a lot of the inoculation happened in the storm from just all the stuff blowing around. And so that will be some issues. And I think most of that will be just some kind of unsightly looking corn. Whether it causes a mycotoxin, I'm not too sure. But these are things we can test for. And there's maybe 400 mycotoxins out there that we know of. We generally test for about 6 of them. And generally though, if you do have one of those 6, you probably have some other things going on too. And so that does make an issue for selling the grain. And we'll have to kind of keep that in mind as time goes forward here. Because I see then it becomes a salvage grain issue. And really right now we're dealing with 2 salvage issues. We got the corn that was in storage in these bins that blew over. So some of that corn was still okay, that was able to be picked up, salvaged, sent to an ethanol plant or whatever. Some of it got damaged too much rain, whatever, got some cement in it, and that we can maybe use for cattle feed. And I say cattle really can utilize this quite well and do good on it. The same thing with our light test weight corn, for pigs and chickens or ethanol or whatever else we want to sell corn for, they get a little bit fussy about test weights getting too light. And this year, if we have corn that was maybe just starting to dent when it blew over, and then it got flattened and kinked or whatever, the test weight in that corn, if it hits, 40 pounds a bushel, that might be all it does. But, with cattle feed and other ruminants, sheep too, they do use that light test weight corn quite well, and the performance from regular corn to light test weight corn really doesn't change all that much. And actually for long-fed cattle, which is currently the trend, where we're feeding cattle to 1,600 pounds rather than 1,300 or 1,400, that long-fed cattle, they seem to do even better on the light test weight corn, because the starch tends to erode their stomach after a while. And with the light test weight corn, what we're dealing with is lower starch contents, but we still have all the fiber, the protein, and the fat there. And they do use it quite well, and you really don't see a decline in performance. So it can be a pretty good opportunity for a cattle feeder, or even someone feeding out feeder lambs, to get a hold of this light test weight feed and use it for cattle. And it's a good option for someone that's growing a lot of grain that normally would be docked heavily for light test weight feed, that has an outlet for it. So I think that's something to be aware of. Now, the other thing is with this mold and mycotoxin problem, some of these molds that show up on the grain, like the black specks and the kind of bluish specks kind of mold that people don't like to see when they buy grain for their chickens or their hogs. Cattle don't seem to mind that either. It doesn't seem to hurt them at all. There's other molds that make the mycotoxins, like aflatoxin, can be a problem when it gets too high, but cattle do have a pretty good tolerance for that. Same thing with vomitoxin. Pigs don't tolerate that at all. Cattle do have a pretty good tolerance for that. So that, in terms of the molds, mycotoxin issues, we do have a good outlet there as well. And we're kind of lucky here in Iowa where we do have more than one outlet for our grain. So it's something just to be aware of. Now, there are some molds and mycotoxins that we got to watch out for that can cause a lot of damage to cattle. So that's something we'll have our radar out for. But currently, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. So going forward, I think this may be a good outlet in terms of what to do with grain that we need to salvage that we can't sell normally. Another thing, I guess, to look forward to is, we did lose a lot of storage capacity in central Iowa from these storms. In these bins that were empty or just about empty that blew over, there's a potential that we're going to have to store corn on a bag, in bags or on the ground covered. And when we do that, we sometimes can get ourselves into some problems. And the other thing is too, we may have some wet grain out there because I say this corn that tipped over is not drying out as fast as that still stands, because it's just like putting hay in a tight windrow. It doesn't dry very well. It's got to have a lot of airspace. And when we have wet grain, the next thing we can get is a grain fire, and that's what's going on in my picture here. And what really gets people in trouble with grain fires is you have one crop that's dry in a bin, and then you put corn on top that's maybe a little bit wet, and that seems to be the biggest problem for causing a grain fire. And the other thing is it can get out of condition. Then we go back to a salvage situation. What do we do with this grain? And they say cattle are sometimes a pretty good outlet, but once it burns up, then we're a little bit trouble there. So that may not be, it's something to be aware of going forward. And maybe next year at this time, what we'll be dealing with is corn that got out of condition in storage because of this year. So it's just something to be aware of, because it generally happens when we have a bad harvest conditions this year. Next year, we're going to have some issues of grain and storage for that gets forgotten about or not put away quite right, or who knows what happens. So when harvest happens, it's a pretty intense situation. We kind of forget what's all going on. But by the time we forget what the previous year's situation was, we get in trouble the following year with a grain fire or some corn that gets kind of crazy in storage. So that's kind of really what I got going on here. So I guess I'll kind of turn it over to you, Brian, if you have any questions that need to be followed up on, and I can maybe answer.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate all the great information there. You covered a lot on some nutrient content, some feeding considerations. One question I do have is, what about testing the grain? So if cattle producers are wanting to feed some of this potentially damaged grain, should everyone just plan on doing some testing for molds, or is that more of a case-by-case basis?
Well, a lot of times if it is mycotoxins, you can't see them. And if you've had problems in the past, you're probably going to have problems for sure this year. So I guess in those situations, it sure doesn't hurt just to get a sample and send it off and get it tested. Now I say, depending on the situation that grain was growing in, if it's been like towards Carroll, Iowa, they had a lot of drought this past summer in that west central Iowa area. I would be looking for some aflatoxin issues going on there. And I say a lot of times you can't see it, but it's there. And if the more fiber you have in that corn, so let's say you make silage, or if you use like earlage or something of that nature, generally those mycotoxins hang out in the fibrous part of the plant. We generally think about the grain and the toxins in that because when we feed pigs or chickens, but actually if there's a little bit in the grain, there's a lot in the in the fibrous part of the plant. So I guess I would, I think it may be a good idea just to check that out. If you're in eastern Iowa and you had good growing all season, you probably don't have much for mica toxins, but you could have some if you get some salvage corn, or if something did get kind of crazy while it was down and you harvest it and you don't quite get it put away quite right. And sometimes that happens with silage harvesting. You get a humongous pile, you don't get it covered or packed quite right. Then you can get a lot of yeasts and molds growing in there and stuff happens. You may or may not have mica toxins, but it gives you some assurance if there's nothing there. Because, if you got 100 tons of silage, a little test isn't too expensive then. So I think it doesn't hurt. It gives you kind of a reading on what's going on and what to expect. As far as the nutrients go, that's a $25 test. And, considering, a steer is almost $2,000, a finished steer when the market's up, it's really a pretty cheap test. So, the nutrients I would do that no matter what, because that's something it's a cheap investment really to feed it right. The mica toxins, that's a $100 test. And, considering the value of what cattle are, the value of all that feed you have, $100 isn't really much compared to, what you're dealing with. So it's easy to do. The labs that do it are pretty easy to find. We use Rock River Lab. We use Dairyland Lab out of Wisconsin. There's Iowa Testing Labs, there's Omaha. There's a lot of labs around. Your feed guy would have access to all of them. And I think it's a good year to get a reading on what you're dealing with there.
Great, thanks so much. One more question. Do you have any thoughts on pricing some of this grain? So, if you're going to sell to a co-op, obviously they have their formulas for dealing with low test weight and things like that. But, what about cattle feeders? Maybe you're going to buy some grain from a neighbor or something like that. Any thoughts on, price adjustments if you're purchasing feed?
Yeah, that's a kind of a wild card, but a lot of times the other markets dictate what we can pay and get away with. It's usually the answer is as little as possible if I'm buying, and I want to get as much as possible if I'm selling, and that battle continues every day. But if we're dealing with silage, a feed test will quickly tell you where you stand in terms of nutrients, and depending how far along the cob was developed, could be quite a bit more energy in that than not. And really the hay markets kind of dictate where the silage market will be, just as it's brought to the same level of dry matter. So if hay is running $100 a ton, silage will probably be about a third of that based on the moisture and the energy differences. And so that'll probably be the biggest dictator there. So that's probably where that'll run. So if you got silage where the cobs all fell off when you're harvesting, then the nutrients go down quite a bit and it becomes more like low quality hay, and that market will dictate the silage in terms of that. As far as the dry grain goes, there's actually quite a bit of grain trade with damaged grains out there in feed yards. And whether it be a barge on the Mississippi that gets wet and the corn gets out of condition and becomes cattle feed, or if it's a mycotoxin issue, or if it's burnt grain from a grain bin, there is a kind of a underground market going on there all the time. And that does kind of run the pricing of a lot of that. And generally, depending on how damaged that grain is, you're going to be, it's kind of based back to the energy content. So if the energy content is 1 megacalorie of net energy for good grain, and if you got light test weight and it's running about 60% of that, that's generally will be where that grain price will be in dry price. Now the cattle tend to perform a little better on that light test weight corn than what's expected. So it's a kind of a nice bonus for cattle feeders, but to keep the playing field kind of equal, it's generally goes back to the megacalories of energy in that grain, and it's backed off accordingly that way. And I say there are a lot of other damaged grain markets out there that are doing that already, and it just kind of will kind of help guide what it will become. But generally, it's an energy issue when it comes to grain. So.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Garland, for sharing the information and for joining today. For those of you listening into the podcast, we will post some links to some additional information in the podcast notes, so you can look for that. This will be up on the Iowa Grain Quality Initiative website, where you can also find other information due to the derecho and crop damage. So thanks everyone for listening.